Lucas was a 16-year-old boy with a mop of unruly brown hair and a pair of well-worn sneakers that had seen better days. He lived in a modest neighborhood where the houses leaned close together, their paint chipping in quiet defiance of time. His mother worked long shifts at the diner to make ends meet, and his father had passed away when Lucas was too young to remember much about him. Despite their struggles, Lucas carried an easy smile and a knack for finding joy in the smallest things. On rainy days, he would pull on his patched-up raincoat, roam the streets with his trusty umbrella, and imagine himself an explorer charting uncharted territories. He found freedom in these walks, a momentary escape from the responsibilities and worries that often weighed on him. It was on one such rainy afternoon that Lucas saw him, a man in his 80s, standing on the corner near the old bakery. The man was hunched over slightly, his shoulders curved under the weight of years, and his face, though kind, was deeply lined with wrinkles that told stories of a long life. He wore a heavy brown coat and a bright red scarf, but his shoes were soaked through. In his trembling hands he clutched a soggy piece of paper. His eyes darted around anxiously, filled with worry, as though searching for something invisible to everyone else. Lucas noticed how people hurried past, umbrellas bobbing like jellyfish in the drizzle, but no one stopped to check on the man. Lucas's mother had always told him, kindness costs nothing but is worth more than gold, and he couldn't just leave the man standing there. Adjusting his umbrella, Lucas approached him carefully. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked gently. The man turned to him, startled at first, but relief softened his faded blue eyes like stormy skies on the verge of clearing. I can't find my way home," he said, his voice trembling. "I have an address here, but the rain." He held out the crumpled piece of paper, its ink smeared beyond recognition. "It's all ruined." Lucas took the paper and studied it, hoping to salvage something, but the words were too blurred to decipher. "What's your name?" Lucas asked, his tone calm and reassuring. "Edward," the man replied after a pause. "Edward Whitaker, my wife. She must be so worried. She'll be wondering where I am." Lucas nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I'll help you get home, Mr. Whitaker," he said. Tucking the soggy paper into his pocket, he offered the man his arm. "Let's start by getting out of the rain. There's a bakery just over there." Edward hesitated, but Lucas's steady presence seemed to comfort him. Together they walked into the warmth of the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread and pastries enveloped them like a hug. Mrs. Klein, the bakery owner, looked up from the counter and smiled at Lucas. "Back again, Lucas. And who's this?" "This is Mr. Whitaker," Lucas explained. "He's trying to find his way home, but we don't know where that is yet. Do you recognize him?" Mrs. Klein tilted her head thoughtfully, then shook it. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't think I've seen him before. Poor man must be so scared." She handed Edward a warm cup of tea and a freshly baked roll. The simple kindness brought a small smile to his face, and Lucas felt a surge of gratitude toward Mrs. Klein. But he knew they couldn't stay long, they needed answers. After thanking Mrs. Klein, Lucas led Edward back outside. "Do you remember anything about your house?" Lucas asked as they walked. "Maybe a landmark nearby or what it looks like." Edward furrowed his brow, struggling to grasp the details through the fog of his memory. "There's a big oak tree," he said slowly. "And a green door. My Marjorie loves the color green." It wasn't much, but Lucas latched onto it. He decided to head toward the park where a cluster of oak trees stood. As they walked, Edward spoke in fragments about his life, piecing together glimpses of who he was. He mentioned Marjorie, his wife of 60 years, and how she always took care of him. "She's my anchor," he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without her." Lucas felt a pang in his chest. The love in Edward's words reminded him of the rare photos he had of his own parents together, the quiet affection they had shared before his father's passing. "We'll get you home to her," Lucas promised. When they reached the park, Edward's steps faltered. His eyes scanned the towering oak trees, and his expression shifted. "This feels familiar," he said quietly. Lucas spotted a row of houses just beyond the park, one of which had a green door. "Let's check that one," he suggested, his hope rising. As they approached, the door opened, and a woman stepped out. Her silver hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her eyes, though tired, lit up with a mix of relief and joy when they fell on Edward. "Oh, Edward," she cried, rushing toward him. "I've been so worried." "Marjorie," Edward whispered, his voice breaking as he embraced her. Lucas stepped back, his heart swelling with relief. Seeing the couple reunited made all the effort worthwhile. Marjorie turned to him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You brought him back to me. Please, don't go. I'd like to thank you properly." Lucas hesitated, unsure what she meant. But he nodded. He hadn't helped for a reward, seeing their joy was enough. As he stood on the porch, the rain stopped, and a single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. It felt like a new beginning. Lucas waited on the porch as Marjorie ushered Edward inside. Through the doorway he could hear her soft reassurances, her voice like a balm as she helped Edward out of his damp coat and scarf. Lucas stayed rooted in place, unsure whether he should leave or wait as Marjorie had asked. He fidgeted with his umbrella, watching the last droplets of rain slide off its edges. The golden sunlight breaking through the clouds felt like a promise that things were about to get better, not just for Edward, but for himself as well. A few minutes later, Marjorie returned to the door, a warm but tentative smile on her face. "Come in, Lucas," she said. "You've done so much already. Please, let me offer you something warm to drink." Lucas hesitated, glancing down at his muddy sneakers and worn jeans. "I don't want to bother you," he said shyly. "You're not a bother," Marjorie replied firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Please come inside." Reluctantly, Lucas stepped over the threshold, slipping off his shoes at the entrance. The house felt cozy and lived in, with shelves lined with books and photographs chronicling decades of family memories. Lucas's eyes lingered on a picture of a much younger Edward and Marjorie standing by a lake, their smiles radiant. He noticed the faint scent of lavender mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed tea. It was a comforting contrast to his own home, where exhaustion and survival often left little room for such touches. Marjorie led him into the living room, where Edward sat wrapped in a soft blanket, his hands curled around a steaming cup of tea. His face, though still etched with weariness, had regained some calm. Marjorie handed Lucas a similar cup and gestured for him to sit in a chair across from them. "Edward tells me you found him on the street," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. Thank you." Lucas felt a flush rise to his cheeks. "It wasn't a big deal," he said with a shrug. "I just wanted to help." Marjorie shook her head gently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You did more than help, Lucas. You brought him back to me." For a while they talked about Edward's day, and how he had become lost while Marjorie had been out running errands. "His memory has been slipping for some time," she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "Some days are better than others, but today was a hard one." Lucas nodded, his heart heavy with sympathy. He couldn't imagine the fear of losing someone you loved so deeply, or the helplessness of being unable to rely on your own memories. Marjorie excused herself briefly, leaving Lucas and Edward alone. Lucas sipped his tea, then glanced at Edward, who had been quietly studying him. "You're a good boy," Edward said suddenly, his voice clear and steady. Not everyone would have stopped. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "It just felt like the right thing to do," he said simply. Edward smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "The world could use more people like you." Marjorie returned moments later with a phone in hand. "Our daughter Linda and her son Ryan are on their way," she said. "I told them what happened, and they can't wait to meet you." Lucas sat back, his stomach twisting with nerves. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not for something that, to him, seemed so ordinary. He debated whether he should make an excuse to leave, but Marjorie's warm presence made it difficult to say no. The doorbell rang a short while later, and Marjorie hurried to answer it. In walked a woman in her 40s with sharp yet kind features, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Beside her was a teenage boy about Lucas's age with sandy blonde hair and an easy grin. "Oh, Mom," the woman exclaimed, hugging Marjorie tightly before rushing to Edward's side. "Dad, I was so worried." Edward smiled at her. "I'm fine now, Linda." Thanks to this young man, he gestured toward Lucas, who stood awkwardly in the corner. Linda turned to him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "So, you're Lucas," she said. "Thank you for bringing my dad home. You have no idea how much this means to us." Lucas shuffled his feet, unused to such direct praise. "It wasn't a big deal," he mumbled. "It was everything Linda insisted. You've brought us peace of mind." Ryan stepped forward, his grin widening. "That was really cool of you," he said. "I don't think I'd have known what to do if I saw someone lost like that." Lucas shrugged, still unsure how to handle the attention. "I just wanted to make sure he was okay." Marjorie returned with a tray of cookies, setting them on the coffee table before motioning for everyone to sit. Despite his initial hesitation, Lucas felt himself relaxing in the presence of the family. They were easy to talk to, and Ryan's light-hearted jokes made him laugh in a way he hadn't in a long time. After a while, Lucas began to feel like he should excuse himself. He started to stand, but Marjorie gently stopped him, her expression resolute. "You've done something extraordinary today, Lucas," she said. "We'd like to do something for you in return." Lucas shook his head quickly. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. "I just wanted to help." "I know," Marjorie said, her smile soft. "And that's exactly why we want to. Please stay a little longer." Reluctantly, Lucas agreed. Though he didn't fully understand what they had in mind, a small part of him was curious. As the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected, something life-changing was about to happen. As the evening deepened, Lucas sat on the couch, his hands cupped around the tea Marjorie had given him. The warmth from the cup seeped into his fingers, grounding him in the unfamiliar but comforting environment. Ryan and Linda were chatting with Edward, their voices soft and filled with concern as they asked questions to gauge how he was feeling. Every so often, Edward would turn to Lucas with a small smile, as though to remind him he hadn't been forgotten. Marjorie appeared from the hallway, carrying a polished wooden box that gleamed under the soft light of the living room lamp. She approached Lucas with careful steps, her expression thoughtful. This she began, opening the box to reveal a leather-bound journal and a silver pocket watch, belonged to Edward. Lucas looked up at her, surprised. "Why are you showing me this?" Marjorie placed the box gently on the coffee table and sat beside him. "Edward was a teacher for nearly 40 years, she explained. He filled this journal with stories, lessons, and quotes that he shared with his students. It's his way of capturing what matters most: kindness, patience, and the value of helping others. He used to give copies to his students when they graduated." She picked up the pocket watch, its silver surface catching the light. The words engraved on it were simple but profound: "Time is the most valuable gift you can give." This watch was a retirement gift from his students, Marjorie continued, her voice tinged with pride. They pooled their money to buy it for him, because they wanted him to know how much his time and guidance had meant to them. Edward always said he would pass it on to someone who embodied the same spirit of kindness and selflessness. Marjorie's eyes met Lucas's, and her smile softened. "That someone is you." Lucas's breath caught. "Me? But I didn't do anything special." Marjorie reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You did, Lucas. You saw a man in need and didn't hesitate to help. That kind of heart is rare, and Edward and I believe it should be celebrated." Before Lucas could protest, Linda stepped forward, holding a small white envelope. She handed it to him with a kind smile. "This is for you and your mom," she said. "We know how hard it can be to make ends meet, and we hope this can help in some small way. Lucas hesitated, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope. His eyes widened when he saw the crisp bills inside $500. He looked up at Linda, his voice breaking. "I can't take this. It's too much." "It's not too much," Linda said gently. "It's a token of our gratitude for what you've done for our family. Please let us give this to you." Lucas's mind raced. He thought of his mother, who worked double shifts at the diner and still struggled to pay the bills. He thought of the grocery list she kept tucked in the corner of the fridge, the items at the bottom always left unchecked. Tears pricked his eyes as he clutched the envelope and the watch. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Marjorie smiled, placing the journal in his lap. "Promise us one thing, Lucas. Promise you'll keep paying it forward." Lucas nodded, his resolve firm. "I will. I promise." As the evening wound down, Linda offered to drive Lucas home. He hesitated, embarrassed at the thought of them seeing his modest house, but she insisted, and Lucas eventually relented. During the drive, Ryan chatted easily with him, cracking jokes and sharing stories about his own school life. By the time they pulled up to Lucas's house, the tension in his chest had eased. Linda parked at the curb and turned to Lucas, her expression kind. "You don't have to be embarrassed about where you come from," she said gently, as if reading his thoughts. "What matters isn't where you live, it's the person you are. And Lucas, you're an incredible young man." Lucas swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he said softly as he stepped out of the car, clutching the envelope and the watch in his hands. Inside, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Her uniform from the diner was still on, the name tag slightly crooked. She looked up when Lucas entered, her tired eyes lighting up with relief. "You're home late," she said. "What happened?" Lucas placed the watch, the journal, and the envelope on the table in front of her. "I helped someone today," he said simply. He explained everything, how he had found Edward, helped him get home, and the gratitude the family had shown. As he spoke, his mother's expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment. When she opened the envelope and saw the money, her hand flew to her mouth. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. This is incredible." "They wanted to help us," Lucas said. "And they gave me this too." He held up the watch, its silver face gleaming under the kitchen light. "It's not just about the money though. They told me to keep paying it forward." Tears welled in his mother's eyes as she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You have no idea how proud I am of you," she said, her voice breaking. "Not because of the money, but because of your heart. You've always been a good boy, Lucas, but today you've shown me just how amazing you are." Her words filled Lucas with a quiet pride, but he knew this was just the beginning. He had made a promise to Marjorie, Edward, and their family, and he intended to honor it. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew one thing for sure: he was going to find a way to spread the kindness he had received. The following morning, Lucas woke to the sound of rain tapping lightly against his window. He lay in bed, staring at the pocket watch on his nightstand. Its silver face glinted in the soft morning light, and the engraved words "Time is the most valuable gift you can give" echoed in his mind. He had promised to pay it forward, and he couldn't ignore the pull in his chest to do something meaningful. After a quick breakfast, he bundled up in his raincoat, grabbed his umbrella, and stepped into the cool drizzle. His mother called out from the kitchen, "Where are you going?" "Just out," Lucas replied with a smile. "I'll be back later." He wandered the streets, thinking about Edward and Marjorie. Their gratitude had left him humbled, but more than that, it had left him inspired. As he passed the community center, something caught his eye: a brightly colored flyer taped to the door. "Volunteers needed. Help our seniors with errands, chores, and companionship." Lucas paused, reading the details carefully. It wasn't glamorous work, but it seemed like the perfect way to honor his promise. He stepped inside and approached the front desk, where a kind-looking woman in her 60s greeted him. "Hi, I'm Lucas," he said nervously. "I saw the flyer outside. I'd like to volunteer." The woman's face lit up. That's wonderful. I'm Mrs. Harper, the program coordinator. We're always looking for young people to get involved. After filling out a few forms, Lucas was paired with his first senior, Mr. Benson, an elderly man who lived alone in a small apartment a few blocks away. That afternoon, Lucas knocked on his door, unsure of what to expect. "Come in," a gruff voice called from inside. Lucas opened the door to find a stout man with a cane sitting by the window. His sharp eyes studied Lucas for a moment before softening. "You're the volunteer, huh?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Lucas read. Mr. Benson chuckled. "No need for the formalities, kid. Call me Benson. What are they sending you here for?" "Anything you need help with," Lucas said. "Groceries, cleaning, company, you name it." Benson raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching with amusement. "Well, let's start with you telling me what a kid like you is doing helping an old grouch like me." Lucas smiled and shrugged. "I guess I just wanted to give back." Over the next few weeks, Lucas visited Benson regularly, helping with errands and chores. But what Benson seemed to appreciate most was Lucas's company. He would tell stories about his days in the Navy, the travels he'd taken, and the adventures he'd had in his youth. Lucas listened intently, feeling a sense of connection to the man's memories. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Benson said one afternoon as they sat on his porch, watching the rain. "Someone who believed in helping others just because it was the right thing to do." Lucas smiled, thinking of Edward. "I guess I had good examples." The word of Lucas's volunteering began to spread. Neighbors who had once overlooked him started to notice his quiet acts of kindness. Mrs. Klein from the bakery offered him free pastries to take to the seniors he helped. His classmates at school, curious about his newfound purpose, asked how they could get involved. Even Ryan, Edward's grandson, started joining him on weekends to deliver groceries and rake leaves for the elderly. One Saturday, after helping Mrs. Klein move some heavy boxes in her bakery, she handed Lucas a small box tied with twine. "This is for you," she said with a warm smile. Lucas opened it to find a loaf of freshly baked bread, a few pastries, and a handwritten note: "Thank you for showing all of us the difference one person can make." Touched by her gesture, Lucas carried the box home, feeling a sense of fulfillment he couldn't quite explain. The kindness he had received from Edward's family was multiplying in ways he hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, as Lucas and Ryan were organizing books at the community center, Ryan turned to him with a curious look. "Do you ever think about how all of this started?" he asked. Lucas paused, a book in his hands. "What do you mean?" Ryan leaned against the bookshelf, grinning. "Like if you hadn't stopped to help my grandpa, none of this would have happened. All these people you're helping now, it's because of that one moment." Lucas considered this, a warmth spreading through his chest. "I guess I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "But it feels good, doesn't it? Knowing that something small can make a big difference." Ryan nodded. "Yeah, it does." The weeks turned into months, and Lucas's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. His small neighborhood, once a quiet and overlooked corner of the town, began to buzz with a renewed sense of community. Neighbors who had rarely spoken to one another started sharing stories of Lucas's kindness, and soon others were inspired to pay it forward in their own ways. Lucas carried the pocket watch with him everywhere, its weight a steady reminder of the promise he had made. Every time he glanced at the engraving, it renewed his sense of purpose. One evening, as he sat on the porch with his mother, she looked over at him, her eyes soft with pride. "You've changed this whole neighborhood, Lucas," she said quietly. "I hope you know that." Lucas smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his heart. "I think it changed me first," he said. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lucas knew that his journey of kindness was far from over. This was only the beginning.